Sam Thomas, graduate from Oxford with an MPhil in ancient philosophy, where he received a distinction on his degree. That's the equivalent of a summa cum laude for our American listeners. And soon to be graduate student at University College London. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Sam is my philosopher best friend. We went to Oxford together. He's super cool, as you will be soon to find out. So, plan for the podcast today is to look over the 2020 PhilPapers survey professional philosophers, where essentially they asked a ton of professional philosophers, what's your view on this philosophical topic? And it was a good way to see what most philosophers think about most philosophical issues. So we just kind of somewhat randomly picked. We picked our favorites, the ones we thought we had something interesting to say about. So each of us, the outline is that each of us will briefly state our view on that particular topic after explaining it. And then we'll have a roughly 5-minute conversation back and forth we'll talk as long as it's interesting. And then we'll say what the majority view among philosophers is. But we'll say it after we've spoken about it so as not to bias the conversation. So the first one we go with is a priori knowledge. Sam, what's a priori knowledge?
So this will be a little bit of, I think I'll say it a little bit differently than you. I realize there's a bit of an American English versus British English translation issue.
Probably.
I think if I say a priori,
you're probably more correct.
Knowledge.
Yeah.
No, I'm pretty sure that's a genuine
dialectic difference.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, okay. So a priori knowledge is knowledge that I would describe it as knowledge that doesn't require experience. It is not based on experience. So you can give an example of an a priori proposition is something like all bachelors are unmarried men. And then you could have the sort of opposite of it. The experience-based kind of knowledge would be like a posteriori knowledge, which is something like there are such things as bachelors, there exist bachelors in the world. It's a proposition that's sort of about the world. I know there are this is when I have to kind of dive deep into the memory of early undergrad philosophy. I know that Kant introduced like a sort of distinction, I think, within a priori knowledge about this sort of analytic synthetic, I guess. I think it was what it was called. So analytic so what I gave at bachelors or all bachelors are unmarried men is an example of an analytic piece of a priori knowledge where it is sort of true by definition. And then you have your synthetic stuff, which is requires like a kind of, I guess, like some sort of form of connection, but it's not still based on experience. So 2 + 3 = 5 is an example of a synthetic a priori statement, where you don't there is no sort of 5 within 2 or 3. But it's still not something that sort of by experience, supposedly. Yeah, I guess is that a sort of suitable summary?
Yes. Yeah, I think we can work with that. I think so. The question is getting at, do you think that there can be knowledge essentially through reflection alone, any kind of knowledge, or does it all have to come back to this experientially based knowledge, empirically based experience of the world? That's the only source of knowledge. It's interesting because the question asked to philosophers doesn't distinguish between analytic and synthetic varieties of a priori knowledge, because I think it would be difficult to maintain that. I think it would be far more common that philosophers will affirm the analytic a priori knowledge, because these are things that are true by definition. Once you know what a bachelor is, you know that they are unmarried men. The really interesting question is whether you can get more substantive claims about the world from just a priori reflection alone, just thinking about things really hard, the synthetic a priori. And so for me, I'll just start with what I think. I think we do have a priori knowledge, but I also think that we have synthetic or more substantive knowledge about the world that's possible through just philosophical reflection alone, that doesn't ultimately reduce to a posteriori or empirical experience. I think that philosophy as a discipline can issue in conclusions about the world. Now, at the same time, I'm very agnostic about most things. So maybe I don't think that, but I would like to think that like philosophical reflection, what we normally do as philosophers is a source of knowledge about substantial issues like the existence of God, the nature of space and time, the reality of free will, and so on. Various ethical judgments and reflections, truths in normative ethics, meta ethics. Most of that is not going to, like, the conversation surrounding them is not a scientific conversation. You're not going to find statistics or lab results or experimental results discussed in journals of philosophy when they talk about those things. So unless you think that that's all just speculation, baseless speculation, you've got to think that you're engaging in some sort of prior to experience reflection, and you should think that it's meaningful, that there's a chance that it's actually connecting with the truth. But I might not be understanding the distinctions here very well. I guess I would just say, in short, my high view of philosophy as a discipline, I think, impels me to think, yeah, there has to be some sort of chance that philosophy is, through its methods of just reflection, is getting at the truth. So that's my...
Yeah, I'd say I'm sort of, broadly in agreement with that. I think that, I guess that sort of analytic side of a priori knowledge is, I suppose, the perhaps more often critiqued part, because you could sort of, I think the humane angle on that was just simply that's, I'm kind of just, I'm not really, I don't know anything through that form of a priori knowledge. It's more like it's a kind of like a tautology, I suppose. Obviously, bachelors are unmarried men. It's that doesn't enhance it doesn't grant me any sort of knowledge, and it's the synthetic side that seems perhaps to be the more interesting, more substantive side of the a priori knowledge. So I think that I would say yes, there is a priori knowledge, because I would affirm that there are such things as the analytic side are true. I would also think that there are hopefully synthetic things, because, like you said, I think it seems like, in my sort of low level experience in the area, comparatively to a lot of like actual professional philosophers, obviously, I think that philosophy does seem to quite kind of depend a lot on there being a priori knowledge. And I sort of think you raised some excellent points about there are certain things, I think metaphysical things, which seemingly require, in my plebeian mind, a priori knowledge, such as God, time, space, anything that is quite difficult, I guess, that you cannot sort of experience empirically. Does seem like we would sort of require a priori knowledge to get to that. I'm not entirely, again, I wouldn't call myself a sort of modern epistemologist by any stretch, so I'm a little bit unfamiliar as well, I would say, with how you would, what the I guess empiricist response would be into how might we come up with such things, because presumably there would be philosophers out there who are, well, as we will soon, I suppose, reveal, who disagree with the idea that there is a priori knowledge, and yet presumably in the discipline of philosophy they would perhaps still be discussing such things as God or time or space.
Well, I think one point we'll touch on at the end is about the significance of this survey, insofar as it's canvassing philosophers across all subdisciplines and then asking them their opinion on this very specific issue. And I'm not sure how helpful or meaningful that result is, because philosophers, as you know, can become ultra specialized within philosophy. And so they don't necessarily have a profound grasp upon philosophy as a whole. But that, we're going to get to that later, because there's a specific issue here where I'm going to really hammer away at that point. So are you good there? Have we hashed this one out?
I think I've probably said all I could reasonably say without making a fool of myself. So yeah.
Just start like pontificating. So 73% of philosophers surveyed believe we have a priori knowledge. And that seems right to me. If we're correct here that this method is kind of a presupposition of philosophical reasoning, well then, yeah, philosophers are going to think we can have it. But I would want to know whether or not they mean analytic or synthetic a priori knowledge. It'd be very hard to deny that we have access to analytic truths, trivial truths, truths of logic in this kind of way. It would be easier to say, well, sure, we have these kind of bare bones trivial facts that we can know independently of experience. But once we get to anything of substance, that's when we need empirical investigation. And so I would want to know what philosophers mean the 73%, what they mean when they say we have a priori knowledge. And there, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'd also be quite curious about the 18 or so. I've got it up here as well. The 18 or so 18% or so who say that they accept or lean towards there being no a priori knowledge. I mean, I
Yeah.
guess what I'd be curious about is what do they really mean? There is no kind of the a priori knowledge is just simply just not very important, and that there are such trivial analytic truths, and yet they don't perhaps count as
Yeah.
knowledge. Because I think it seems odd to see that higher percentage of philosophers dismiss there being a priori knowledge.
Yeah.
I would have thought that, I'll be honest, you said you weren't too surprised at the 70 something percent. I kind of thought that'd be much higher, but there could be the interesting, you said there are perhaps these procedural errors just in the survey itself.
Yeah, I think you'll find that 73% is like the highest this thing goes. Like that's the biggest majority you get anywhere. And so I think that's the nature of philosophers. Like there are, I think it was like, well, I won't reveal anything, but when we get to the like external world skepticism, like, are we dreaming right now? There's more philosophers than you would think that seriously entertain that scenario. So what are you going to do? All right, so the next one is the aim of philosophy. What is philosophy about? What is it trying to do? And so the survey gave four possible answers. And I should say, as a methodological point, we went with the inclusive figures here, where you were allowed to give multiple answers, which I think is fair. Some of these questions, these issues admit of multiple stances. They're not mutually exclusive. So specifically here, the four things philosophy might be getting at, according to the survey, are truth, understanding, wisdom, and happiness. So
I think you might have, sorry to interrupt, I think you've forgotten one.
Did I?
A rather relevant one, I suppose, given my kind of subdiscipline, goodness/justice.
Oh, I did. I didn't even. Well, that one's not it. So, okay, we'll just leave that. Okay, goodness and justice. All right, good. Yeah, Sam, you can get out. I think we're done here. I think we're gonna end the interview there. That was disrespectful. Wrap it up. No. So I said, I think that understanding is the primary goal of philosophy, but I do think it's followed by knowledge/truth as a goal as well. I don't think it's solely the aim of philosophy just to understand the relevant disciplines or the relevant questions and subdisciplines and issues. I do think it is an aim of philosophy to get at the truth. But I just think if you look at what philosophy typically does do, in fact, it aims at understanding far more often than actually getting at knowledge or truth. But I do want to preserve that role for philosophy because I think it would threaten to undermine the significance of what philosophers do, is if all we're doing is trying to really understand the issues and how they relate to one another and the questions and the distinctions and the sub-distinctions you can draw, getting a lay of the conceptual landscape, that's important. But if that's all we're doing, well, it's not nearly as significant as if you could come along and say, yes, but we can also get at what's true here. We can figure out the right position amidst this conceptual landscape. So I guess that's not really an argument for thinking that philosophers do in fact get at the truth. It's just saying, as a philosopher, I want that to be true. So that's what I think. What do you think, Sam?
I think it's interesting that you went with that as your kind of, definition of understanding, because I read it a little bit differently. And perhaps, I think it's weird because I think you were probably right about how perhaps the majority of philosophers are interpreting understanding. I was looking at it as in this, I remember I was reading a Plato, an essay, a paper on one of Plato's dialogues, the Meno, and that talked about how we might translate this word episteme in the Meno, and typically that's knowledge, but this paper argued that it instead should be understanding, which is perhaps a more technical term than how you were employing it, where understanding is some sort of thing that is higher than knowledge, perhaps, where understanding is, where knowledge is, if you were to take that kind of like justified true belief, it's sort of like, it's about a specific thing. You might have knowledge of a proposition or something like that. Understanding is a broader picture, which combines perhaps many, many propositions, and also seemingly requires a grasp on how they kind of map together. It's like a structural understanding, perhaps, of knowledge. So I guess I was sort of reading it perhaps like that, but I think you're probably right. I reckon that this is not being employed in that kind of like technical sense, like epistemological sense, maybe that it's rather just, yeah, you might be right in terms of like, it's the purpose of philosophy is maybe not quite something so bold as knowledge. It is just merely to kind of clarify issues. Um, but either way, I think quite I lean towards happiness. I think, but not in like a kind of, I don't know, like not in a. I think this is probably quite informed by my background in philosophy, being primarily ancient philosophy, where I think that the philosophy that you get from the pre-Socratics is very much this kind of philosophy of knowledge or understanding, typically perhaps understanding in the sense you mean, where they were more interested in understanding the kind of the physical world. But then you get along come Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and especially in Socrates, you kind of really do get the sense that philosophy ultimately has this goal of happiness, where knowledge is one part. So it's not like the knowledge is not involved in the process at all, but that happiness is one of the central goals, aims of philosophy. And in terms of how to, the eudaimonia sense of like how to flourish, how to live a good life, not merely like a kind of hedonistic, pleasure-based happiness, but an actual kind of a human flourishing kind of happiness. And I quite like that idea. I think obviously, I think I can understand why when you ask, I assume the survey was carried out amongst sort of like Western analytic philosophers primarily, that they would, they wouldn't value happiness quite so much. But personally, my view is I quite like to think that philosophy should aim not merely at these other things, but also at happiness, in that it is, it's sort of it can be a kind of a way of life and not merely like a sort of a discipline that you engage in
Yes.
in universities or whatever.
Well, I agree with you. So I think my more refined answer would be that when we have to distinguish between, I guess, the aim or intention of philosophy in an ideal setting versus how it's actually carried out in the real world. Because I agree with you that it needs to be an aim of philosophy to get to a more holistic understanding of life that benefits you in the way you live so that you can be happy and to treat other people well. But I wonder if in practice, if we look at the people publishing in journals of philosophy in the Western world or professional philosophers employed at universities, I imagine it's a far more dry intellectual pursuit for most of them. And I think maybe that means they've become detached from the original purpose and they're missing out on the benefit that could accrue to them if they take this more holistic understanding of their discipline. But I could just see, for example, many philosophers of math or philosophers of science or logicians. It's just such an ultra specific intellectual pursuit. I just don't know that they're engaged in those same kind of questions about the good life,
Yeah, exactly. I think that you're right. I think that it's definitely not exclusively happiness, and nor do I think that when you look at modern day philosophy with all of its subdivisions and everything, is at all the same philosophy that was being practiced by my beloved ancient Greeks.
Yes.
And therefore, I think it's right that I would say the aim has progressed and it has broadened. And I think I think you can obviously make arguments for all of those things. I'm always a little bit. I think the one that does throw me off a little bit is wisdom, because I feel like they're really throwing out different terms for what do they mean? Like, is that in a sense of to become wise? The goal of philosophy is to simply just. I see.
But how is wisdom different from like? What does that add to truth and understanding? I mean, surely. Go ahead.
Sorry, I suppose if you think of it in terms of, I was conceiving it in terms of, you have understanding is clarifying, perhaps. Knowledge is the one that would make sense why that might be perhaps a popular answer, in terms of, whatever definition of knowledge you subscribe to. That should be the goal of philosophy. I sort of saw wisdom as kind of like a more personal thing of like, if I acquire X, Y, and Z knowledge, I might gain this status of wisdom, and that might lead to some kind of like, I don't know, enlightenment or something. But yeah, I think this is a problem of they're not really defining terms, and as philosophers we love to define terms, and I think that when you ask a question so broadly so broad as this one, you would benefit from offering a little bit more about, I guess, either employing technical terms like, I think happiness can be knowledge can be, understanding can be. I think wisdom is the one that is kind of the odd one out there.
Yeah, where you're like, that's actually pretty vague. I think
Yeah.
for that reason, surveyors allowed you to give the option of other and then to fill in the blank,
Mm,
but they didn't
mm,
report what any of the like other answers were for any of
yeah.
the issues. They just said other. So that you
Mm,
realize there's a level of ambiguity if a bunch of people said other.
mm.
So here it was 42% said truth, 56% said understanding, 31% said wisdom, and only 13% said happiness. So I feel like that's like some empirical evidence for what
Yeah.
I was getting at there. That like these people, they're not,
Yeah.
they had the reaction I did, which was like happiness. Now, what did
Yeah.
truth, justice in the American way? Like who put justice here? What was the
Yeah, well, again,
split for that?
I think that's another one. Is a that's another one where I think that you could definitely look back at like ancient Greek philosophers and see that justice was perhaps like this much more integral part of philosophy.
Yes.
Where you can look at like Plato's philosopher rulers, where it's like the thing that enables them to rule justly is their philosophy. But again, I feel like it's you're perhaps interviewing the wrong group of people nowadays, because I don't really know how many philosophers
I think that.
now see themselves in Plato's philosopher rulers or vice versa.
No.
So yeah, I think I would guess that would be my kind of thought process of why justice is included there and not something else,
Yeah.
or why justice was granted a spot in the top 5 reasons. It seems like it must come from this kind of where philosophy can enlighten you not merely to sort of, I don't know, intellectual truths, but also like perhaps more practical ones, and those
Yes.
enable a greater understanding of like a political art. But,
yes. Well, and I think that's an important role that's been neglected, but I'm not surprised that most of our ilk are like, no, not that one.
No, they're not okay.
No.
Yeah.
All right, so the third is eating animals. It's pretty straightforward. Sam, you start us up here. Do you think we can eat animals? Like it's morally permissible to eat animals is the question.
I think I struggle with this one a great deal because I am a meat eater. I will out myself not as a vegetarian or vegan. But I think I really struggle with to come up with arguments for why I should be allowed to be, why it is morally permissible for me to be a meat eater. Other than I guess like sort of like speciesist ones of just that like, we might value animals less. But even then, I think even if we value animals less than we value humans, it's sort of like, you can kind of picture it to spoil another one that comes up, like a trolley problem scenario. If it's not like I am choosing between killing animals or killing humans, I'm just simply choosing between killing animals or kind of slightly inconveniencing myself by not having as nice tasting food as I was before. And I guess if you were to get rid of, like practical arguments against veganism or vegetarianism, which are just simply like to make everybody vegan overnight would just utterly like ruin multiple industries and perhaps like globally you mess up climate change and things like that. But I think it's quite hard to come up with arguments for meat eating like that make it morally permissible, in like an ideal world. But I don't know. What do you think about it?
I agree with you. I struggle with it, and I eat a lot of meat. And increasingly over time, I've come to the exact same place you did, where there are some good arguments, or at least seemingly plausible arguments against eating meat. I've not come up with any for them, specifically in most contexts. So what I said here is that I think it's becoming increasingly likely to me that it's impermissible to eat animals in most contexts. Because if animals can experience pain in roughly the same way that we experience pain, if they have phenomenal consciousness, if they can suffer, well, then what we're doing on factory farms is horrific. I mean, beyond horrific. And many vegans make the point that it's just because animals can't talk. They don't have a language. They can't convey to us directly what they're going through. That's why we can fail to see it. But once we get over that conceptual leap and understand that there's still something going on inside, how do you justify the conditions we place like chickens in, for example, where they're in a box, a cage that's just as big as them, and that's it? I mean, if there's anything even half as conscious as human beings in that condition their whole lives, it's horrifying. And then the second point would be that I can't see any way to escape the conclusion that animals do in fact experience suffering at that level. I mean, you could just blankly deny that animal consciousness, just say, well, they're just like robots. But there's no motivation for that view. And I think the same arguments you'd give for that could be used against saying that other people are conscious. I don't see a principled distinction. But that still leaves open the question about like more humane treatment of animals. Like what if you have a farm and you let your livestock live a happy and fulfilling life and you kill them near the end of their natural lifespan anywhere, or hunting, for example, where they're killed humanely and painlessly? That's less clearly impermissible because I think there's a real difference between person and non-person animals. Obviously, we are animals, but we're also persons. And I think that makes a morally relevant difference. So I don't want to give into like baseless human exceptionalism. But insofar as we are people, we have personhood, and other animals do not. Like that has to make a moral difference. And I think part of that will be the morally relevant features surrounding killing and consuming or not. That's why I think it's impermissible in all other than the very obscure circumstances that philosophers come up with, it's impermissible to eat a person. It might not be for an animal in the context that I've outlined where they're free from pain. That's where I'd be open to it. I've yet to see a really convincing reason to say, well, that's not, can't do that.
I find it interesting as well that I think a lot of our arguments for the sort of, let's say, moral impermissibility of eating meat are mainly like sort of production based. And I guess that's going to be the case when you live in a society that, you know, allows this level of consumption of meat, because that doesn't arise without the production methods that we also have, and that those are kind of the more abhorrent parts of eating meat. And I think it's where it's what I guess I just kind of just don't, I just sort of separate. I just somehow manage not to engage in that. I'm not, whenever I'm eating meat, I'm not sort of justifying it in my head as though there's no sort of argument going through my mind saying, oh, I'm justified in doing this. It's just simply that I am just not thinking about it. And I don't know. So it does make me. I kind of been grappling with the issue a bit more recently. It sort of sounds similar, very similar to you, I think, where it's just the more you kind of really begin to work through the problems and why kind of try and come up with any sort of reason why you might perhaps justify meat consumption, it gets more and more difficult, which I think is what makes the answers to this survey more interesting, because I feel like I'm missing something.
Yeah, so do I. And that's why I thought, well, maybe I should look into this area of applied ethics and see like what the actual case is here, because to me, this seems pretty straightforward. Like the things we've been saying here, I don't see a way around it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. It's just that I think what the other factor that gets me is that I owned a pig in my early days when I was like 17. My mom and we had a pet pig, and you quickly discover that these things are just as emotive and smart and as regular domesticated animals, and that the chance for human connection with them is just as great. And then you generalize from that and you think, well, if it holds for the pig, it probably holds for all of these animals that I'm consuming. And if that's the case, if I think it's abhorrent to eat a dog because they have something close to a fully formed personality, it's probably the case for other animals as well. I'm just not exposed to them. And so I think rather than going to the conclusion, well, it's permissible to just eat dogs and cats and so on, it's probably that we shouldn't be eating any of them. But then that kind of argument would seem to spoil my nuanced answer where it's okay to eat animals if they're not in pain. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it gets interesting when you realize many animals have like unique personalities. That seems morally relevant. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess exactly. It all comes down to, I think it's the production side of it is what's sort of most abhorrent, and it's also it's an interesting why. I guess it's because I guess a lot of these arguments against meat consumption and for vegetarianism focus on production, and yet I don't know, why is those principles don't apply for, say, like hunting based things? If you're hunting your meat and you're using all of it, you're sort of ethically consuming it in that sense, where you're not sort of sending most of it to waste. Why is that any better? Is it just simply that we're not subjecting the animal? The animal has lived free of all of the life it has known, and its shape of life, its well-being is far greater than the factory farmed animal, and it is hopefully sort of put out like instantly when you're hunting it.
Yeah.
But you still, potentially cut that life short. But I guess I feel like that has perhaps more justification perhaps in nature, maybe, where you could appeal to a sort of natural arguments or nature-based arguments for why it would be the case that humans can hunt and kill and eat meat, but not factory farm meat.
Yeah, I've heard a hunter give the justification, which I'm not sure about, that like if these animals didn't die by being hunted, they'd probably die a horrific death by being eaten, or breaking their leg and slowly starving to death. I mean, that's a good point. Animals don't usually die old age peacefully in their sleep in the wild. That normally doesn't happen. So there is that point that you're not necessarily depriving it of anything, and you might actually be giving it a better way to go than if you didn't hunt it. I don't know. I'm not sure about the reasoning behind that. That might admit of certain very obvious counterexamples, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It'd be interesting as well because if you were one of these sort of I don't know, kind of like I think back on like Epicureans and their approach to like death and how dying isn't bad, sort of for the one who dies, provided of course that the death isn't painful or anything like that. It does seem like you can perhaps justify the hunting an animal yourself and eating it yourself as that is far more defensible perhaps than in the defending anything like factory farming
I think most
the
people would agree with that.
scale of meat production.
Yeah. And I think it's splitting hairs at a certain point because the vast, vast, vast majority of animal consumption and animal product consumption occurs in factory farmed contexts.
Yeah.
And so even if we got rid of just that, it would be a huge improvement. So right. So then we have to give the point that 48%, the plurality anyway, the one with the most philosophers, said that it is permissible to eat animals and animal products, which, okay, that maybe they are operating with the same subtle distinctions in mind that we have between factory farmed animals and free range, which they did not specify in the survey. So I guess that kind of mitigates the shock of like, really?
Yeah, that just to me seems like the only reason why it's sort of in a vacuum, the consumption of animals is okay. It's just simply that, one can heavily disagree then with the means by which we put meat on the plate in front of us is the morally impermissible part, perhaps, of that equation.
That is the best I can come up with, because besides that, as a reflective philosopher myself, I can't see how so many people would come to that place. So, okay, good. Number 4 is the experience machine. It's a thought experiment here, which helps us to sharpen our intuitions about what matters in life and what's meaningful and what is good and what's truly valuable. The experience machine is a machine you can enter, which gives you nothing but pleasant experiences. And the question is, do you enter the machine? Is it worthwhile to enter the machine or not? Because obviously, like real life, it's involved with pain and suffering. And you can imagine in this machine that you can have any kind of pleasurable and amazing and beautiful experience, but all you're getting is the experience. In reality, you are just, say, a brain in a vat or a body lying in the matrix or what have you. And crucially, you're not connected to other people. Now, I think that's the general outline of the experience machine, but do you have any detail to add here? Granularity?
I guess the only thing is that I think I guess you didn't deny the opposite of this, but like, it's worth stressing that this will feel real. It's not like sort of like playing a computer game or something. This is you are aware that you are in there, but only because you actually put yourself in there. Otherwise everything feels entirely real in the experience machine, is I believe a stipulation of that thought experiment.
Yeah, well, we could even make it even better that upon entering, you immediately forget that what you're experiencing isn't real, because we want it to be as one-to-one to a real perfect life as possible. So you enter this machine, it's the ultimate perfect life. And insofar as the machine continues to exist, you will as well. But the question becomes, should you enter the machine? Or are you sacrificing something that is not worth giving up by entering the machine? And what it ultimately will potentially signify is that there are things that are valuable in life that aren't reducible just to our experience of them. There's something more objectively valuable or there's something more valuable about the objective reality than just our experience of it. So the question is, do you enter the machine? My view, and I'm pretty certain of this, which is interesting because most philosophical questions I'm not. You should not enter the machine. You should not trade up real life for a perfect simulation thereof. Now, there are a few stipulations that are necessary here. That the first is that you're not connecting with other people in the machine, real people. That's part of the scenario. If you are, that makes it a more gray issue in my mind. But insofar as it's just you in that machine, even if you are certain in the machine, in the experience machine, that you are interacting with real people and they're simulated perfectly, you're not actually interacting with people. I think that means you shouldn't enter the machine, because what matters in life is, like, love, for example, is a fundamental, valuable, and perhaps the most fundamental and valuable thing about life. And you can't love a simulation. You can have an emotional experience, for sure, but the real thing, the morally relevant and valuable thing in its fullest expression, involves two real people connecting with one another. You're not going to get that in the machine. You're not going to have friendship. Your children aren't going to be real. Your parents aren't real. It's just you. It's just you. And that's very lonely and sad when you ultimately think about it. So that's what I think. Sam?
I think you've very well captured, I think, how I immediately reacted to that thought experiment of, I think that the number one good, I think that it neglects, and I think that this is the one that a lot of people will would put a lot of people immediately off it, as you highlight, is personal relationships, friendships, or just sort of love, perhaps, whether that be platonic or romantic or whatever. All of that is gone, and I think that those are goods that we do value, a lot more than perhaps we may realize if we kind of, even if you. That's because I always kind of see the experience machine as sort of reducing it all to pleasure, and I guess it's primarily, I suppose, an argument against some forms of hedonism, where you are, when given the opportunity, most people would actually, in fact, choose not to live the perfect life of perfect pleasure. They would, a sort of a life of tranquility, free of disturbance. They would instead choose the goods that seem to matter the most, I would say, immediately are things like friendship. And I find that quite interesting because, that's been, I suppose, it's been a long philosophical tradition since, like, Aristotle about the value of friends. And, it's quite, I always find it quite interesting that Aristotle devotes almost a quarter of his magnum opus ethical work to a discussion of how friendship works, and the sort of the goods that one can gain from friendship, and that, in fact, like, perfect friendship is one where you almost are mutually benefiting each other and becoming sort of achieving more eudaimonia through friendship, that in fact you cannot actually have that sort of perfectly virtuous life without friendship. I think the other interesting thing about the machine is that if you are living this sort of perfect pleasure life within there, I think there's, like, sort of, I guess you might call them, like, well-being perhaps based arguments, where there is actually benefits to having, downs as well as ups in life, in that we kind of think that we value, like, a sort of a shape of one's life when it comes to well-being, and that we want some downs so that we can appreciate the ups, and also, I guess, like, that we can actually feel like we've achieved the ups ourselves through past setbacks and things like that. So yeah, I suppose I also definitely wouldn't plug into the machine, and I think it is primarily for the reasons I think that you've also described, the way it is. It really does neglect that sort of the good of friendship, which seems to be utterly independent in some ways from just sort of pure sensory pleasure. But also, I think that because there is a certain value to the shape of one's life and the kind of, I guess, personal control that one can have over it.
I think that a lot of people will argue, it's probably not the majority view among people generally, but a lot of people will say, yeah, enter the machine or enter the simulation, because from your internal perspective, it's identical to the real thing. So what difference could it possibly make? But I think that neglects the fact that the most valuable aspect of love and friendship is the objective reality of connecting with another human being. And it's not, that element is not reducible to the experiential qualities of it. I mean, obviously, I think that's relevant. You want to feel the love too, but you've emaciated it, hollowed it out if all you have is the experience, but not the actual reality of connecting with another human being. And I think so. I think it just it arises from an unreflective place to say that it's exactly the same, that nothing is really lost by entering the solo simulation.
Yeah, and I think there's the kind of there's the dual aspect to that where you might it might feel the same when you are getting the same, you're deriving the same sensory pleasures or whatever from your friendships within there. But I think where the difference is most apparent would be in the reciprocal part of friendship, where you are kind of hoping to benefit your friend just as much as they are benefiting you. Where I guess even if you aren't sort of aware of that difference, like on the surface, because that by all accounts these people in the machine are your friends, you would perhaps notice that would be the thing that you would feel missing, perhaps more than just that. The kind of the love that you would derive from them is also perhaps the love you can give to your friends. You are giving that love to like a simulation.
And I think that highlights the point that even if you couldn't tell whatsoever within the machine that you are not actually accomplishing that end, you still want to be doing that. You want your actions to result in a benefit to the people around you, unless you're just a self-absorbed narcissist. You care about these people and you want them to benefit. You want them to feel loved, but they don't feel loved because they don't exist. And that makes a difference to the moral value of the reality you're going through and to your life that you're engaged in there. It does not have those real goods. That's a real loss. And I think it makes it not worth it. It's not worth the trade. Yeah. And fortunately, 77% of philosophers agree with us here. I think that's like the highest out of any.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at that, actually. I think that does seem like the one where it would be very. I'm almost quite curious why it's such a high percentage of philosophers, or relatively high percentage, choose to enter the machine, I think.
I mean, what do you have the breakdown in front of you? Because there is that other option. So I'm curious if maybe.
I don't have. I think I've got it somewhere. There it is. The other just says accept an alternative view. The question is too unclear to answer. Things like that. I think they don't seem to give other, sort of actual positions on the matter. It just sort of, expresses, I guess, like confusion or dissatisfaction.
Yeah. Well, I'm just wondering if a large share of the rest of the philosophers would opt for some sort of clarifying position that's not necessarily disagreeing that you shouldn't enter the machine, just as philosophers do. But I mean, I see 77% and I go, okay, good. I was going to be very disappointed if 50% said, yeah, enter the machine.
Yeah. Yeah. No, fortunately we are on the right side there, I think.
Right. Okay. All right. So the next one, which is pretty straightforward, again, is the external world. Here, the question is, do we have a justified belief in an external world? Or, for all we can tell, should we say that, yeah, we might be in the Matrix. We might be dreaming right now, and we just don't know, or being deceived by an evil demon, or being a brain in a vat stimulated with electrodes by a mad scientist into thinking that there's this external world of physical objects around us, when in reality, none of it's real. And how do we know we're not in that scenario, but in a real objective physical world? So, Sam, you start this one off. Do you think we can know that we're not in these skeptical scenarios?
I would say yes, because I lean towards, I suppose, what they call non-skeptical realism, in the answer of the three options, of idealism being that sort of, I don't know, Berkeley position of there is an external world, but it kind of is entirely depends on our mind.
Yeah, it's interesting because
everything exists by perceiving it.
To me, that's a form of realism that, like, especially on the theistic versions of this view, where there's nothing except for God's consciousness, but there's still an external world. It's just that we're wrong about what we take it to be, if we understand physical in a particular kind of way. But all the things we think exist do. It's just that their natures are different. So anyway, carry on.
Yeah, so I would say that I do think that an external world exists independent of us. I think partly because there's obviously that, I guess, like intuitive desire, perhaps, that there is something, that there is stuff out there. And I think that otherwise I think that has perhaps some sort of bad bearings on, I guess, like other philosophical positions that I hold. I think if one can, I guess, believe in things like a priori knowledge, that then also one should also believe in there being an external world, because that would distinguish between the kind of the a posteriori knowledge that I might hold otherwise. So I suppose, I guess, I don't really have sort of too much more to kind of say about it other than that. I think there's the kind of desire reason where I think that I would like to think that there is an external world, and I guess that I don't find, I suppose, perhaps the critiques against it all that convincing. There's sort of like, I guess, like the senses of deceive us kind of reasons, I think, can be explained with and still keep external world realism, a non-skeptical sort of external world realism. And nor, I guess, I'm rather unfamiliar with the idealism side of things. It sounds like you kind of probably know a bit more about that. I guess that's a kind of stems from like a Descartes or something like that, some sort of position, but it veers off a little bit more. But yeah, what about you? What are your kind of thoughts?
Well, I would be more open to the possibility that well, I think it's certain. Well, not certain, but I think it's almost undeniable that there's an external world of some kind. I'm open to more radical positions, not necessarily idealism, but views along those lines where we are radically mistaken in our understanding of what that external world is. That we do know, broadly speaking, that there is such a world outside ourselves, and that we interact with objects and people and processes, but that their intrinsic nature is radically different from what we take it to be. And so if it turned out that some kind of idealism were the case, I died and God told me this, I'd be like, all right, I thought maybe. Which is kind of my view. And especially when you turn to like fundamental investigations in quantum mechanics or quantum cosmology, where specifically this is a very specific point, but that the suggestion that space and time might not be fundamental, that spatiotemporal reality is an emergent phenomena. It emerges in some way from a non-spatiotemporal structure. And to me, that suggests intriguing possibilities of what like reality ultimately is. If it's not spatiotemporal, well, then it doesn't really look physical in the same kind of robust way in which we think about things. So I would be open to the possibility that ultimate reality of the external world is very different from what we take it to be.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Because I guess I just sort of, I don't know. I just kind of think, I guess you feel like there's some sort of refuge perhaps in like harder sciences as well for a kind of external world realism. Again, like, I suppose, how do you dispute that position of everything, even all this science that we use to explain the natural world, and we could use to even predict the natural world, could all still sort of be fooling us with some sort of demon. But but
I
again,
mean, I think what it gets to is that you can't really give an argument in the usual sense for realism of this kind, because as you say, it's possible that you have a perfectly orchestrated skeptical scenario, like a simulation or deception by an evil demon or a mad scientist, that perfectly emulates the phenomena you're pointing to, like the success of scientific experiments. Well, that could happen in a simulation. I mean, some philosophers will say that you can give an inference to the best explanation for realism, for non-skeptical realism, because our perceptions are largely unified and coherent. And the best explanation for that is that we are encountering real physical objects that don't radically change over time, that are stable. Whereas if we were in a simulation, it's equally likely that our perceptions would be sporadic and uneven. And so the most plausible explanation of the uniformity of the world and of our conscious awareness is that we're just encountering a real physical world. Maybe.
Is that uniformity in terms of between other observers? So it's like sort of you and I both see that mug that you're drinking from is orange. Like, is that the kind of thing you mean, or is it something else?
Partly, but I think I interpreted it as meaning just the first person individual experience over time, and at a moment of time, there's a certain unity to it and uniformity of it, stability to it.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, no, exactly. I think, it's one of those things where it's quite difficult. I guess this is why I think I portray my limited grasp on sort of quite a lot of topics of modern epistemology, where these are things that I'm just sort of vaguely trying to remember from early years of undergrad. Because ancient skepticism is very different, I guess.
Okay.
There aren't really kind of ancient external world skeptics. It's sort of it's refined. I guess it's sort of restricted more to a kind of like a skepticism about knowledge or skepticism about belief, right?
Sure.
And even then, it's not like a kind of outright denial of an external world. It's a sort of that one must suspend judgment about all sorts of things, and therefore one doesn't hold beliefs, but one can still sort of live, hopefully, normally. There's a bit of debate around that, but it's just that it's doubting the utter, entire, external world, and all of my senses and things like that don't really come up as much in ancient philosophy. So I suppose that's why I've kind of my grasp on the matter is rather limited. But I do find that I find my views are shared, at least amongst the or my broad perspective rather is shared amongst the majority.
Yeah, fortunately, we can all stay out of an existential crisis because 80% of philosophers affirm non-skeptical realism. If you don't have the time to look into all the relevant issues and you want to go on believing in an external world, just run with that. Be like, the experts have thought about it. It's good. It's solid.
I'll seek refuge in that. I think.
Okay, so next, the footbridge / trolley problem. So
I was thinking that's one that I guess I think that this is one of the problems of having a survey that comes in non-alphabetical order, where you get the follow-up, I suppose, problem introduced before the actual problem.
Right. So if you want to go ahead, outline both because they go together, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. So I imagine a lot of your listeners probably have heard of the trolley problem. So you encounter a runaway trolley, as in a train car, barreling down a track. You see there are 5 people tied to the railway track in front of it, and then there's also a side track which has one person tied to it, and you have discovered the miraculous lever that will enable you to divert the trolley from hitting the 5 who are tied to the track to hitting the 1. And then the other part of this problem is you might sort of change your perspective on the matter and then say that rather than you encountering the lever, you're instead standing on a bridge that is where the trolley will go underneath, and you have the opportunity to push somebody down in front of the trolley, and that will stop the trolley from hitting the 5 who are tied to the track. So in this case, it's moved your sort of 1 versus 5 trade from being flipping a lever to hit them to perhaps more actively pushing them. And I think that often when you introduce that sort of second dilemma, or that sort of alternate angle on the dilemma, can actually have quite a substantial change in the results, at least that you get from kind of like the everyday person on the street. It may be I guess we'll talk soon about how that actually, the bearing that has on the philosophers' opinions. But it's it's an interesting recasting of the dilemma, because it is fundamentally the same sort of 1 versus 5 equation, except that you are now having perhaps what feels like a more active role in killing the 1 to save the 5. And I guess, I don't know, I feel like there's plenty of other permutations to that, but I think these are the kind of the 2 interesting ones. So I guess, like, Miles, which do you do in both scenarios?
I'd pull the lever in the first case. That's pretty straightforward. I think most people agree. Like, if I know it I guess I don't know, but I'm 99% confident that if I'm in that situation, I'm pulling the lever. And sorry, Bill, or whoever the one is, but that it's very clearly a numbers game in that case. The second one, again with the majority, I'm not pushing the fat man. I mean, holy bro, can you imagine
Yeah.
actually like a fat man or any person that you're like, all right, I know for some reason if I push them on the tracks, it's going to stop the train. I just can't to be like, oh, like murdering this person, even though it saves the 5.
That formulation is, I think, it's so much more visceral for some reason.
Yes.
And I don't know, because I guess obviously you're doing the same, well, you're exchanging the same number of lives, but there's something that just feels so much more safe and comforting about the lever
Yes.
than it does pushing the fat man. And I really cannot put my finger on why, because I share your view. I think it'd be interesting to know why. What do you have? Let's say you had the option to sort of like really think through and decide. You didn't have to make a split-second decision in the case of pulling the lever. What would be your reasons for pulling the lever?
Well, okay. We should mention the broader philosophical context of this thought experiment. It arises in normative ethics in trying to decide between the two major camps for articulating what the ultimate basis of our moral judgments are. So consequentialism would say that ultimately what makes an act right or wrong are just the consequences of those acts. Deontology, broadly speaking, would disagree and say that some actions are intrinsically right or wrong regardless of their consequences. So what this thought experiment aims to do is to show that there's a problem with consequentialism, that it's neglecting certain factors that are relevant to the morality of our acts or not. And so in the first case, it seems right to say that saving 5 out as is a consequence of pulling the lever, and that outweighs killing 1. So the greater good is brought about by killing the 1. So that's the right action. The consequences of the action are better. We kill the 1. Whereas in the second scenario, there seems to be something intrinsically wrong about pushing the 1 fat man onto the train, even though it results in the exact same set of consequences. And so the question becomes, does this refute consequentialism? And if it does, what's the moral factor we're missing? And I can't tell you. I mean, I don't know fundamentally why. I suspect it has something to do with the connection between the one person and the situation. In the first case, they are far more intimately tied into the oncoming trolley, and they're tied onto the tracks. For some reason, that strikes me as relevantly different than an onlooker on a bridge above the train. They're not relevantly tied into the situation, and you have to far more actively put them into it. At the same time, that's a very thin basis for this really sharp distinction we want to draw between the two cases. And I think a cynical perspective would be that it's just more, there's no morally relevant difference. It's just that you're more intimately and obviously directly acquainted with what you're doing in the second case versus in the first. In the first, you can kind of close your eyes and pull the lever. You don't really have to face exactly what you're doing. There's a physical separation between you and what happens. Pushing that fat man, you're right there. You are right there. And so that's just subjectively worse, but objectively, it's the same moral consequence. Now, I'm actually open to that possibility. I don't want that to be the case because it just seems like there's a morally relevant difference, but try to specify what it is.
It's interesting as well that you brought up the kind of, I guess, the purpose perhaps, or the initial idea behind the thought experiment, because I guess I've sometimes thought about it differently in that I kind of think that the trolley problem as opposed to the footbridge permutation is the trolley problem itself is a very powerful indication of our instinctive thoughts on how we should make moral decisions, or at least in certain cases where instinctively, if the majority are pushing the lever, that means the majority do think the numbers count, and that if anything, that sort of provides perhaps one like a strong perhaps argument for consequentialism, because it shows that it just seems so kind of natural to people. Leaving aside the footbridge scenario for now, just the fact that the majority of people will pull the lever does show, I think, that we all kind of have like a sort of an immediate thing. We might all have grand ideas about how we should make moral decisions, but in the split second, in the moment, we will make the numbers. We'll choose numbers counting over other things. And there's an interesting. I read it. I was made because I did a normative, sort of theory module in my undergrad, and there's an interesting paper that I was led to that just kind of discusses this exact scenario. Does the numbers count, by a guy called John Towrek, who basically wrote very little other than this paper, but it's a very interesting paper because Towrek kind of gives this argument against both positions in a sense. He ultimately arrives at this kind of conclusion that the best scenario is not automatically pulling the lever nor not pulling the lever because of some kind of arbitrary rule. We should instead do something like roll a dice. And if the dice lands on 1, you pull the lever and you kill the 1. Sorry, you'd leave the lever and you kill the 1. But if you land on I'm phrasing this very badly. If the dice lands on 1, you save that 1 and let the 5 die. But in any other scenario, so 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you do pull the lever and you save the 5. And that's the best way that we should be sort of making these kind of number-based moral decisions, essentially by lottery, where you can weight it in terms of numbers, but any more than that, any sort of automatic decision based on numbers is wrong because it doesn't sufficiently value that one person. Ideally, you should not be weighing 1 against 5 because that one person, they're an entire person, and they would never make that decision themselves, just as the 5 would never make the decision to save the 1 over themselves, presumably.
So I think you can turn up the dial high enough that any of the conclusions we ultimately draw look silly. So I think, for example, imagine that there are 10,000 people on the track and there's the fat man in front of you, and you can stop the carnage by pushing the fat man. Now it seems like you should push the fat man. Like at 10,000 people?
Yeah, exactly. It does become. I think this is also, I guess, where you can have there's so many different permutations of the trolley problem. Where the next of the follow up one after the pushing the fat man one, which I suppose the majority will say no to, is where you say, well, in fact, the fat man is the villain who tied the 5 to the track. Now, how do you feel about pushing him? And suddenly everyone's so happy to push him again. But yeah, I don't know. I just think in general, though, I think it's such a strong immediate argument in case for utilitarianism, for a consequentialism of some kind, because it does just show that we do intuitively just value numbers. When push comes to shove, or perhaps when you look at just the average everyday person, that matters a lot. And that, often we should be in philosophy, I think, starting from these kind of majority views. Aristotle calls these like endoxa, and that's where so that should be the beginning of moral inquiry, is what did the majority think, and then kind of, I guess, like sort of starting to refine that and then work out why or how you might improve that somewhat, but not kind of diverting from it substantially or anything. But yeah, I think that, I suppose you could probably make entire whole podcast episodes on the various permutations of the trolley problem. But I don't know, is now time to look at the answers, or do you have more to say?
No, I think that's as much as I've got here, because it's a tough one. Most people will agree.
Yeah.
Here, 56% of philosophers say don't push the fat man. It's the majority view, plurality by a large margin, which corresponds to most people's intuitions.
And the trolley problem one, interestingly, does say, I think the majority actually say switch the lever, as in kill the 1. Whereas, so that is like, it's pretty much an inverse of the two, and there is that some sort of, there is a feeling there. I suppose it does show, actually, in fact, that it's not the case that only numbers count, but that there is perhaps a kind of personal relation aspect to moral decisions
Yeah.
too. Or perhaps there's a greater, for some reason, we feel a far greater sense of responsibility when we are performing the pushing action compared to the pulling the lever action. And I think you probably hit, on the right point there with it being more to do with perhaps that one is already tied to the track, whereas this poor fat man could have just been on his stroll walking along the bridge, and cold-hearted utilitarian just decides to push him
Yeah.
off. Has to make that split-second decision because they're doing it all the time. Their utility calculus was beeping at them, telling them it's time to go. The decision has been made. But I do. It is interesting that's kind of the philosophers also do end up here, kind of tracking, I guess, ordinary perspectives on the matter.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know the current literature surrounding the trolley problem. I mean, I'm sure it's progressed since it was first proposed. It would be interesting to get more detailed analyses of what philosophers have had to say here. So that's a future investigation. The next one is God. That's a big one. Does God exist? Yeah, the question is straightforward. And I'll go first. I'll just go first. I think, so yes, I do think God exists. I'm a theist, and I'm relatively confident about that. But I don't ground my confidence in that claim in any argument per se, like the cosmological argument, the design argument, the ontological argument. I'm agnostic about almost all theistic arguments, or largely agnostic about all of them. And even after all the time that I've spent studying the fine-tuning argument, it's my central research focus, the most I can say is that it might succeed. I'm hopeful that it will succeed, that it succeeds, and I grow in confidence in it the more I look into it. But I'm still just at that might threshold. Or rather, if I were fully honest, I would say that I believe in God largely just because of my personal experience of God, because of something akin to a religious experience that I've had throughout my life. That's nothing dramatic or particularly luminous or powerful, but just a subtle background awareness of God. And that's just the honest answer. I mean, that might seem stupid to somebody on the outside who's raised in a secular culture. That's fine, but that is the truth. And I would also say that I think there's a pretty strong pragmatic argument for God's existence. I think that life is better if you believe, like, the life here and now is better if you believe that there's an all-powerful, perfectly good being directing all of the affairs within the universe towards a good end, your life included. Life is just better that way. You feel better about things by believing that. That doesn't make it true, but it gives it pragmatic value to believing it. And so in that respect, that very truncated version of Pascal's wager, I think, has some plausibility, where if you're 50-50, God might exist, God might not exist, you should probably do what you could to cultivate belief in God's existence, because your life will just go better. That doesn't speak to the truth of any specific religion, because I think the history of religion shows that religion can be a force for evil and make life a whole lot worse if you believe it. And there's questions of how to interpret that. But I think that insofar as we're just talking about belief in God, the omni-God, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, life is better if you believe in God. And so those really would be the reasons I'd cite for why I believe. And hopefully that increases my intellectual credibility and respectability, because I'm honest. It's better. I think it's more, certainly it's more provocative, and in certain circles more respectable to say, yes, all of the arguments, I've thought about this dispassionately, I've weighed them against one another, and I've concluded as an objective, rational inquirer that this is true. But while I think my belief is rational, that's just not the path I followed, and it's not the one that I think the evidence actually justifies. I think theistic arguments raise too many complex, interrelated questions to be able to stand back and say, yeah, I've thoroughly looked at all of them and they all succeed, and that's why we should believe. So there you go. That's what I think. What do you think, Sam?
That's interesting, because I don't know. I guess actually I think I have some sort of sympathy, I suppose, for that view, because I would, formally classify myself as agnostic. I and I think that will become, my agnosticism will also become clearer when I kind of describe how I would conceive of God, because I kind of think that I have very little experience with philosophy of religion, and yet, I suppose it almost makes sense to start from a point of agnosticism as opposed to atheism or theism. It definitely probably, I mean, I don't know. I think that perhaps you kind of present a strong case for starting from theism without really any kind of grounding in philosophy of religion, or perhaps you actually reached your position, your theism, through a kind of strong consideration of all of philosophy, all the things of philosophy of religion you've encountered, and decided, you know what, that's just not for me. It'd be interesting to kind of see if that view would perhaps be shared by a person who's utterly unfamiliar with philosophy of religion. But anyway, I'm digressing. I would consider myself an agnostic. I think I would have probably quite struggled to actually answer that question when it is posed in these binary terms. But I guess if I was to conceive of God, I would conceive of God in this. I've really I have a lot of sympathy for this Epicurean perspective of God, where if there is a God, God is a perfect being in a state of perfect pleasure, and therefore God has no real interest in humans, in the same way that humans would have no real interest in the affairs of ants or bacteria or something like that. That if God is perfect, and presumably that kind of comes with the territory when it comes to God, God should really have no real desire to mess with us. And I think that's an interesting view, because it was obviously, I suppose, a bit of a product of the kind of the views of the Greek gods as meddlers. If you go back to like the Iliad, the Greek gods are always interfering with things, and they are flawed like people, and they fight and have all these kind of feelings and stuff that cloud their judgment. And I suppose Epicurus offered this. I really like this perspective of a if there is a God, and I suppose he was a little bit sort of ambivalent about whether there even was, but if there is a God, God will look like, in that image of God, as if this perfect being in a state of perfect pleasure, and therefore he will have absolutely no concern for it. Perhaps a better way of saying it, will have absolutely no concern for what men are doing. It does not matter to God. And I supplement this a little bit about, I think it's, the same way that we just don't really care very much about like ants. I don't go out of my way to step on ants, but nor do I really think about ants in any other capacity.
You're not constantly worried about ant
So
welfare,
yeah,
Sam?
I think no, exactly. And the same, and I guess if I was to conceive of a God, I've not really looked at many arguments, so I don't really know. This can work with any number of arguments for there being, a creator of the universe, let's say. But I imagine that if this God did kind of set things in motion, or even create things, it did so without much care as to what things would look like, however many thousands or millions or whatever origin stories you subscribe to years later. So yeah, I suppose that's my kind of broad agnosticism, which I can come up with a sort of theism that goes with it, but I don't know. That's basically my all I really thought about God.
Well, it's interesting you make that point of like chronologically, when did I come upon this position? I think in my youth, when I was young, as if I'm not still young, but when I was young, I thought that the arguments were pretty obviously good and successful, and that there were therefore other reasons why people were atheists besides just honestly deciding based upon looking at the evidence that it just wasn't sufficient. But as I've done philosophy far more rigorously and seriously, it's really hard not to embrace just kind of an all-encompassing agnosticism, really across philosophy generally, because like this shit is complicated. And partly it goes back to the question of the aim of philosophy, why I'm more comfortable in saying that philosophy at least successfully gets at understanding before getting at knowledge or truth, because while it's clear that philosophy makes progress in terms of like clarifying the conceptual landscape, it's not clear to me that it makes progress in actually establishing certain things as true or false. And same with God's existence. And yet I do still feel comfortable and reasonable in my belief in God. And so it's because of my acquaintance with philosophy of religion that I've actually pulled back from really affirming strongly in a specific theistic argument. And so that leaves me with the justification I think I would have given you before ever engaging in philosophy of religion, which would be this more experiential component and then the pragmatic justification. I think your position is interesting. I think probably the most, for me anyway, the most plausible way to spell that out would be in not including moral perfection in this being's characteristics, because then if you do that, if this being is stipulated to be morally perfect, it's going to be really hard to argue that such a being could be indifferent to the welfare of human beings or any conscious creatures. I mean, that's the root of the problem of evil. I mean, even the atheist will make that point typically, that if such a being exists, an all-powerful, perfectly good being, well, there shouldn't be evil in the world. And so insofar as evil and suffering impacts human welfare, then this perfect being should care about it. Maybe there's a question of, well, why did they create us in the first place? But barring that, insofar as we do exist now, they shouldn't be indifferent. That would actually be a moral failure to be indifferent. So it depends on how you define perfect, how broadly you construe that, I think.
Yeah, because I think that's the interesting thing, that I think that it's, I guess Epicurus would have thought of his God as morally perfect, but that's because for Epicurus, and I suppose for all of, for many Greek schools of philosophy, moral perfection didn't look like it perhaps did, because God is, I can't really think of, I guess if you have a kind of a theistic morality, it's probably a deontological ethics that follows from it. And that just didn't really kind of fit with how Epicurus saw how to live a good life. It was he thought of a good life as a life where we are free from pain. That was actually the kind of, he was a hedonist, but a hedonist in the sense that we didn't want to kind of satisfy all manner of our desires in just as much as we could. What we really wanted was actually, if the real pleasure is actually an absence of pain, because all pain kind of detracts from pleasure, and that is how he saw a morally perfect God, and that morally perfect God is the only thing, is almost kind of the target, as it were, because morally perfect God is the only thing that is in a constant state of perfect pleasure, because God is the only thing that can ever be free from pain. So that's, I suppose, what I was getting at when it comes to perfect. Yeah, it's different because obviously if God is this, like you say, if God does seem to be morally perfect, but in the sense of having like a sort of a set of ethical following a set of ethical rules, then yes, you're right. It does seem odd that God would be kind of indifferent. But I think that almost like the indifference is almost part of it, where that is the reason for the indifference is the disturbance from pain. It's kind of, it all fits sort of together. The God would be disturbed with pain if he were not indifferent in this case, because God would witness all the sort of, let's say, the evil going on, and I guess feel responsible, let's say, and then therefore that would disturb his lack of disturbance. Right. So I suppose it's you're right. It only really applies if you conceive of God in a certain way, which I think that's why I quite like that version of God as opposed to a sort of a deontologically. I don't know, an ethically deontological, as it were, kind of God.
I think it's a good point. So the interesting thing as a theist is that 67% of professional philosophers affirm atheism and only 18% are theists. Like I said, that's one of the highest. Once you enter 70%, you're looking at as high as they go. And so naturally, I will step back and go, oh, why? And what does that mean for me and the reasonableness or rationality of my beliefs? I mean, I have a few thoughts, but do you have any comments to make about this fairly strong atheistic stance among philosophers and what it might mean?
I suppose it's interesting because often they don't seem to allow the kind of the middle position of agnosticism. And in fact, it's interesting because I know that they give you accept or lean towards. And in this case, almost all of the ones who accept atheism seem to also, almost all of them they basically all seem to accept it. There aren't really that many who seem to lean towards it, if I understand their use of brackets correctly. The figures in the brackets are the ones where they only accept that position. And so, yeah, I guess I'm a little puzzled that it's that high, because I would have thought this is prime material for others, to click other. I don't understand the question,
Yes.
or like this question needs clarifying, or something like that. Yeah, so I suppose it is a little bit of a surprising result, I think.
It's surprising from a certain angle, but from another, my acquaintance with philosophers outside the subdiscipline of philosophy of religion is that they kind of just take atheism for granted. That's just one of the few results that we've actually got from philosophical investigation, is that there's no God. And so it's not as intellectually respectable to believe in God outside of philosophy of religion than it is within. The vast majority of philosophers of religion, I think anyway, are not just theists, but are Christians. And so what I think this point illustrates or allows us to comment on more than any of the others is about the significance of these numbers, the significance of a survey of philosophers generally about a very specific issue. Because if only because of my acquaintance with philosophy of religion, it's here that I am fully certain that the vast majority of philosophers outside this subdiscipline have no profound acquaintance with the literature within philosophy of religion. And so what you're getting is not a survey of all of the experts who've studied the issues thoroughly and this is their settled opinion. You're getting, for many of these people, their opinion on a course they took in undergrad or graduate school, and that's their acquaintance with the arguments. They don't know the literature, the present cutting edge literature on the fine tuning argument or the cosmological argument or debates about the modal ontological argument. That's just not what they're doing. And so for me, I don't find it particularly worrisome that philosophers outside of the subdiscipline have this opinion. To me, it's not the same as if you surveyed contemporary cosmologists about whether the Big Bang Theory is true, and the vast majority would say yes in a certain specified way. It's just not like that. It would be about including like biologists in your survey and then asking them about a very specific aspect of early universe cosmology. It's just not one-to-one. It's not particularly relevant. And I made this point in a dialogue with an atheist who has said, looking at this, we should say the probability of God's existence is very low. And I said, listen, man, I mean, I've discussed these questions with philosophers outside my subdiscipline, and they don't have very sophisticated views on the topic. And when you think about it, to me, that makes a lot of sense. Like the ethicist or the philosopher of art or the philosopher of law or the logician or the philosopher of mathematics, how much time have they spent surveying natural theology or arguments for God's existence? Very little. So they're all atheists? Okay. I mean, I don't know. Some people react to that and they say, well, you're being pretentious. But I just think it's accurate. Maybe it is pretentious, but I also think it's correct. So I don't know. I mean, how do you, what's your take on that?
I guess it's interesting because I hadn't kind of realized that until you sort of pointed out. This question does seem rather out of place because you can kind of look at it in terms of like, you bring up the fact that your theism is not really grounded in arguments, and that you've started off with a very similar position to what you came out of after having surveyed a lot of arguments. True. I suppose, presumably both for and against. And that it's interesting, therefore, asking a group of philosophers this particular question, where you could have phrased it in such a way of how convincing do you find the arguments for theism or atheism, which is presumably how they're conceiving of the other, or at least some of the other questions. And I guess the other questions ostensibly are dealing with these like very integral to philosophy issues. And this is sort of asking philosophers, the God theism or atheism question is sort of asking them in one sense, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? It's something that is entirely perhaps irrelevant to the kind of, I don't know. I don't mean irrelevant in terms of, I'm not trying to cast philosophy of religion as irrelevant here. It's all asking them like an aside. It's asking them like a personal question that has no real bearing on
their work as philosophers. Well, that's the thing though. But I think that point, though correct, generalizes to at least a large swath of these different philosophical issues. in that, like, the logician, for example, I don't know how acquainted they are with the literature on metaethics and like moral realism versus anti-realism. So does that undermine the significance of this survey insofar as we want to try and garner some like expert opinion or consensus on these issues? Because that would be helpful if we think philosophy is getting at the truth. Maybe what a survey like this could help us see is like, okay, well, what do the experts think? Well, if a majority of them think X, that increases X's plausibility. I don't think in the case of God that that's the case, just because I don't think that philosophers outside philosophy of religion take religion all that seriously as something to reflect on philosophically. They just take atheism for granted. So it's not as significant, evidentially, that the majority of philosophers would be atheists. It's like, all right, well, what if, but the problem is the reverse of that. If you then said, well, okay, so what do philosophers of religion think? Like I said, the vast majority of them are not just theists, but they're Orthodox Christians. That doesn't carry evidential weight for a different reason, and that's because people go into philosophy of religion largely because they were already religious. The number of philosophers who went in neutrally to philosophy of religion and came to believe in God, it's going to be very, very small compared to the total number that are in that subdiscipline. And so for a different reason, I don't think you could use those numbers and say, look, people who've looked at the arguments, they all believe in God, and therefore it's likely God exists. Yeah, but you got to be aware of the fact that these people were committed Christians before even going into the discipline in the first place. And as much as we would like to style ourselves as philosophers generally as perfectly ideal reasoners and objective inquirers, that's not the case. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting one, because I do think I figure it's so tough to, a lot of the other questions, even if they are kind of, perhaps flawed in how they phrase their answers, perhaps, or how they even phrase the question, or the answers that they offer, the available options, are perhaps more interesting because they give a philosopher's view on perhaps like a specific philosophical problem. A lot of the ones that we've covered so far are, how do you, a philosopher, respond to thought experiments, which are, kind of part and parcel. These are a lot of our things that we mess around with. And those are interesting because you often can compare them to the everyman's approach to like a thought experiment. Whereas, if you ask the average person on the street, what is a priori knowledge, yes or no?
That's true.
That's going to have a very different answer to, do you pull the lever in the trolley problem? And so I guess it's the theism one perhaps maybe suffers from that kind of problem, but at least I like to think that for many philosophers, they have encountered the trolley problem before, and they've weighed it up, or they've encountered the experience machine before and weighed it up, at least perhaps briefly, even as a logician or whatever, unless they perhaps come into the philosophy via maths and just never really delve very much into anything that isn't logic, let's say, or any kind of like hardcore analytical philosophy. Whereas the theism one, it can be asked like outside of philosophy almost entirely, and that's how it seemingly many of the philosophers answering the survey are probably taking it. But indeed, like, you have the opposite problem, like you say, of if you were to ask this to people in that field, whereas you get interesting answers if you were to ask ethicists about the trolley problem, or if you were to ask epistemologists about the a priori knowledge question, you would get just the opposite skew of the answers in philosophy of religion if, as you say, the field is, the majority of the field are Christian philosophers.
Whereas, for example, there's no bias in epistemology of like self-selection effect of who goes into the field of epistemology. It's not like people who believe in a priori knowledge are far more likely to go into the field. No, I mean, I don't think anyway. Largely that just comes about as a result of doing it. You go into it for broader reasons, and that will attract people across the spectrum. Most atheists, for instance, just don't go into philosophy of religion. Why? And there's logic to that. Why would you spend all your time thinking about something you think that is ultimately not real? So so that's why I think it's just a wash, cuts both ways, and you just have to look into it for yourself and see what you think. So I say we'll skip knowledge just because that overlaps a lot with.
I was going to move
things we've already. But meaning of life, this is a good one. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about this. Yeah, so is the meaning of life objective, subjective, or does it not exist at all? Those were the largely the three options philosophers were given. And I don't know how much there is to explain on this. The survey didn't add anything else besides it. It's just a meaning of life. Like, okay. So, yeah, I mean, Sam, what do you think? Is there an objective meaning to life, a meaning to life that's independent of what we think, just like 2 + 2 = 4 is objectively true in that robust way? Or is the meaning of life subjective? It's just what we say it is, I guess, is the idea. And then there's this third option, it doesn't exist at all. But it would be hard for me to differentiate that from subjective. So anyway, Sam, what do you think?
I guess I would think that the subjective approaches, I suppose my view on that, what that distinction might be, is that the subjectives are perhaps your, I don't know, Sartrean existentialists, where you kind of think that one can assign one's own meaning to life, but that doesn't mean that there must be no meaning. Whereas I suppose I would think these existential nihilists almost are taking the much stronger position of no, there cannot be any meaning to life. In the same way that the objectivists are taking like a much stronger meaning of yes, there is only one meaning to life. It's yes, there is meaning, and it is what I say it is. I would think I would count myself as an objectivist, I guess, in this question. I like to think that there's a kind of, I don't know, a purpose to what it is to be human, and that we are humans have a purpose in the same way that everything has a purpose. Animals have purpose. Objects have purpose. Things like that. This is very much like influenced by my study of ancient philosophy. Aristotle, has his famous sort of like function argument that the knife that cuts well is the good knife, and therefore the human that humans well is the good human, and that what it means to be a human well is to achieve like happiness, eudaimonia. And the way to do that for Aristotle was through virtue. So therefore, there is a kind of, he was an objectivist about in terms of like the meaning or purpose of life. And I like to think a similar thing. I think that I guess I could see there's probably a lot of attractiveness to a more subjective answer to that question. And it perhaps is the one that is the maybe easier to defend one on the surface, because you could simply look at all these people who are arguing for all the different meanings of life and come to the conclusion that why are any of these more appealing than any other one, and yet still not then fall into kind of a nihilism, because you might still think that because there are so many people arguing for these different meanings of life, surely there must be some sort of meaning of life. So yeah, I would say I would count myself as an objectivist, I guess, but I think that there are strong arguments, perhaps maybe stronger arguments for subjectivism.
That's an interesting take. I mean, I've always been curious about the ultimate justification you could give for thinking that there is any kind of objective function of a human being, or any non-question begging argument you might give for that. Because like what is the ultimate ground for saying that a human person has a specific function versus this just is what they do? But function to me seems like a normative concept. It's like what you ought to do. But like where does that come from on Aristotle's view of this is what we ought to do? I mean, it's one thing you could say this is what we were made to do, but that begins to look theistic. Like this is our function because that's how we were designed. Okay, I get that. But if you remove the theistic underpinnings, now I don't really understand the ground for like function to feature into your worldview.
I guess, I don't know, I suppose this probably runs into that sort of like is or gap problem. Naturalistic fallacy, I think, is kind of tied to that perhaps as well. And I'm largely unfamiliar with the kind of the more modern literature on that area, but I'll try and give this my best shot in brief. In that I think that we can obviously look at all sorts of other things and see that they have functions. So I suppose it seems rather natural to follow from that why not humans have a function. And I guess now the question is, why should we follow that function? Because what distinguishes humans from knives or from any other thing is that they simply sort of, I don't know, I guess they kind of, we only use them for their function if they're an inanimate object. You don't use the knife to write letters to a friend or something like that. That's what the pen is for, and vice versa. You don't use the pen to cut cheese. But I wouldn't. I guess yeah, it's difficult to try and then infer from that why I ought to follow my function. Other than, but I suppose that doesn't mean that the function
Right. I was going
isn't
to say,
there,
like, you could even say
and
that.
that's why I guess there's a sort of.
Yeah, no, you're good.
Sorry, go
You
ahead.
could even say that about like an objective purpose to life, even if you've established it maybe independently of function, but grounded it in some other way. You could still step back and say, well, why should I care? So maybe that's an independent question
Mm,
of why that ought to
yeah.
matter to you. But it's just that, like, I find plausible anyway the Christian apologetics argument that, like, without God, there's no ultimate meaning or purpose in life. Not necessarily, because I think there are other conceptions of ultimate reality that would still ground pretty clearly in an ultimate meaning to life, even if it's not like the omni God. But if we get too far away from that, and specifically we get to naturalism, where the natural world's all there is, and we are largely just the accidental byproducts of the evolutionary process, you're not going to get a purpose to life, because purpose, I think, requires some sort of preordained plan of, like, this is why human beings came about. It was to accomplish this particular end. And then, like, meaning, what does it signify ultimately? Does it make a difference? Again, I, because I said I think that we do have an objective meaning to life, but, like, I don't have any good arguments for that claim. Again, my rationale at this point would still just be pragmatic. Like, nihilism, if that's the alternative to objectivism, and maybe it's not, but nihilism is, you should avoid that at all costs. Like, you can't really come back from that big black abyss of meaninglessness and well, nausea. Like, that was one book that was written about this idea. It's like, it just creates nausea, and it does. And so you should avoid that at all costs if you can. So I think there's a really strong, maybe the strongest pragmatic argument you can come up with for thinking that human life does ultimately make an objective difference. It's for some purpose, even. It signifies something. And so that's why. That's why. I just can't see a consistently happy life. I don't know how it's possible if you deny an objective meaning.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the happiness thing, because I think that was for a lot of for the ancient Greeks authors that I'm familiar with anyway. That was kind of the sort of the ultimate end of humans. You ask, why do you do X? Why do you do, because I want to do Y, and so on and so forth. That then eventually all things lead to, because I want to be happy. And again, I don't mean happy in a kind of hedonistic sense, but like this sort of like flourishing sense, and that in itself should be enough justification for why I ought to do my function, because if that is what sort of, I guess, distinguishes human is its unique function, and that is, if I am doing my function, then I am being happy, and that should be the why. That is the kind of the missing ought, I suppose, for the ancients anyway. And it's a way of not grounding it in a kind of like I've been assigned a higher purpose by I've been assigned a purpose by like a higher being, let's say. It's rather just that, simply in the same way that the plant or the tree or the animal wants to flourish, the human wants that too, and therefore ought to do that. And you can track all of my desires ultimately will lead to wanting to achieve that purpose, that fulfill that function. Yeah. So I think I suppose I guess there's obviously been huge amounts written on this, but that, I suppose, would be my kind of like sort of summary of the
Well,
matter.
it's interesting, because I think you're right. Like, ultimately, you can't really ask the question, why should I be happy? Why should I care about being happy? It's the foundational thing at which ultimately everything else aims. And so it's kind of self-evident. Why should you be happy? Well, that's the thing you should do. Once you understand what happiness is, it's obvious that that's what you should aim for. It's interesting. It's interesting. 33. This is. I didn't expect this. I thought the majority of philosophers would say the meaning of life, if it exists at all, is subjective. But 33%, while a plurality, say it's subjective. 32% say it's objective. I was very surprised at that. I thought, really? Where are they? Where haven't they shown us what it is? Like, I think the study of the meaning of life, whereas like you might think of that as the ultimate original purpose of philosophy, that's been largely sidelined
Mm.
in contemporary analytic philosophy. You're not
Yeah.
getting a ton of publications about
Mm.
the meaning of life or lack thereof. That's too big in general, and philosophers,
Mm.
they just haven't thought about that very much. Not to the level of sophistication
Mm.
of like the fine-tuning argument or the foundations of mathematics. Like, they just don't. And yet a third
Mm.
of philosophers think there's objective meaning to life, which I think
Mm.
at least in the perception of like Western culture broadly, outside of a religious viewpoint, like it wouldn't mirror that. The common wisdom, I think, is like, no, the meaning of life is subjective, but
Mm.
that's okay. That's enough for a happy life. So I'd be
Yeah.
curious to ask him, like, well, what is it? What do you think it is?
Yeah. You're right. I've never really encountered very much. I've read very little on meaning of life entirely, and I guess outside of just encountering these famous figures amongst, like, let's say nihilism or subjectivism or whatever. Yeah, I have very little idea what. Yeah, I don't think I read a single thing, in fact, that would say here's an objective meaning for life,
Right.
and it
And
is this, this,
arguments
this,
for
this,
this
this,
view or
and this is
that
why
view.
there is an objective meaning for life.
No.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I guess it's you sort of find that, like, the only views I found that represented in my reading have been
Yeah.
the ancients, and it does seem to have been like sort of
I
sidelined.
think that's right.
I don't know. Maybe it's bigger more in like sort of like, I don't know, continental
Yeah.
philosophy. Perhaps like ancient Chinese philosophy has more of an emphasis on that. But slaves as we are to analytic philosophy, being in the English speaking world, yeah, we're
No, I
screwed.
agree. Okay, so
I'll go back to
let's see here. The next one we'll do here is the Chinese room thought experiment. So, the context for this thought experiment is a view in the philosophy of mind called functionalism, that having a mental state ultimately is just executing a certain function. That is to say, a particular and consistent correlation between, as I understand it, like environmental inputs, stimuli, and behavioral outputs, and correlating them in the right way so that a particular function is realized. And so being in pain literally is getting a certain environmental stimuli, like putting your hand on the stove, and correlating that through the hardware of your brain in the right sort of way with the right behavioral output of pulling your hand back and saying, ow. So there's a function being instituted here. The kind of intuitive way to think about it is that functionalism says that the mental life and mental states and events, that's like the software of the computer. And then the brain and body are the hardware. And obviously with a computer, you don't have a physical thing and a non-physical thing. You just have the physical thing, but the software exists at a certain level of abstraction. It's the same thing with mentality and the physical body. So functionalism is a type of physicalist construal of the mental life. Now, the Chinese room thought experiment comes in and aims to show that this view is silly. And as I understand it, you have somebody within a room who has a handbook that shows. So what happens is they're in this room. They don't know Chinese. That's the first point. And they're given a window opens, a door opens, they can't see out of it, and a certain Chinese symbol is thrown in. And the book tells them, okay, grab the symbol. If this symbol pops out, grab this other corresponding symbol and push it out on the other side of the room. Now, what he doesn't realize is that what's happening through these exchange of symbols is an intelligent conversation that a native Chinese speaker could step back and see. Okay, if this symbol or series of symbols is given, it makes sense that this would be the answer. You could think of it in English too, and inside as someone who is a non-English speaker, they're able to perfectly emulate understanding English by giving the right answers, but they have no idea what is actually being said. They just have the guidebook, and so they know the manual. They know what symbols to give out from based on the ones they're given in. So the point here would be that functionalism seems to indicate that either the person or the room itself exemplifies the right sort of functions to ground understanding Chinese. But nobody in this situation, the person or the room, actually understands Chinese. So the point would be that functionalism misses a key component of the mental life, of actual understanding, which is a pivotal mental state that one could have. So Sam, do you think that the Chinese room or the person in the room actually has the relevant mental state?
Yeah, I would go immediately no on this one. I think this is to me, I think one of the easier easier questions to be asked. And I would actually be intrigued to hear kind of arguments to the contrary about this, because again, this is one of those problems that I encountered in undergrad philosophy, and I found it quite interesting, and it is especially um, important, I think, today because it is really present in a lot of the large language models, AI, ChatGPT, things like that, that we encounter that we are advised not to use when writing our essays. And that is actually good advice, because it really is, these are what is being, we are feeding in symbols effectively, and ChatGPT or any other LLM does not even understand these. I think does not understand these symbols, and then fires out things in return. And you could kind of, there's a great example of that where people have asked ChatGPT something like, how many R's are there in strawberry? And it doesn't seem to understand that question. It will give you 2 or 4, or it won't give you 3. If it gives you 3, it doesn't seem to do so any sort of consistency. It doesn't do that 100% of the time. And that, would indicate a lack of understanding. In the same way, if you were to ask the man in the Chinese room who's handing in and out these symbols, what order were the strokes written in? Because Chinese, you have to write sort of like top to bottom. He would have no idea because he doesn't speak a lick of Chinese, nor write any Chinese. So my immediate thoughts are no understanding on that one. What about you, Mark?
Same. I wish I could give a provocative, like sharp disagreement, but it's just obvious to me that the room and the man does not understand Chinese, and therefore, unless you give a really subtly revised version of functionalism, which I'm sure there are such that have been debated, and I don't know philosophy of mind very deeply, you can't reduce mental states to the function that they realize. The general critique of functionalism is that, and I think the Chinese room gets at this, is that it leaves out the most important aspect of a mental event, of mentality and consciousness, which is the intrinsic felt quality or the qualia of the experience. You don't capture. So when you put your hand into an open flame, there is an intrinsic felt quality or feeling of it, which is just like the essential nature of the conscious experience. You leave that out entirely if all you describe is the function in terms of behavioral environmental inputs and behavioral outputs. And therefore, you've left out the most important aspect of consciousness. I realize that's very controversial, whereas to me, it's just like as blindingly obvious as something can be. That's what it is. It's actually quite controversial these days to say that qualia exist or are relevant, important, blah, blah, blah. But be that as it may, I'm short of like a very powerful argument to the contrary. I'm going to run with this for the rest of my life.
Yeah, me too. I think to me, this was just sort of one of those ones where I just have an obvious
like, that's fine.
Which maybe is a bad sign, because I feel like in a lot of these questions we have been, sort of like not quite fence sitting, but we've been rather reserved perhaps in our answers. But yeah, this one to me is just rather obvious. And I think, I don't know, perhaps I'm kind of like biased or colored by our experience of it is probably through things like LLMs. That's where we kind of can really encounter it. But yeah, I think to me that just I think it's obvious, and I have no desire to search anymore on this
Same. I'm not like no, it's like nope, we figured that out.
No, there's a lot of areas of philosophy where I'd love to know more about it. This one, I am perfectly happy with my level.
I agree. I say that now, but it might be when I actually dive into philosophy of mind. I'm like, oh, I was so wrong. Now though, honesty is likely. Okay, so the next one, our penultimate one, is immortality. The question here, I think, was just like, if you were given the chance of being granted immortality, would you take it? I'll give my answer first. I think you'd be crazy not to accept like Zeus's offer of eternal life, so to speak. You don't have to tie it specifically to the Greek idea of eternal life, but just if you could be given eternal life, living forever, being immortal, guaranteed, I think would be the height of irrationality to reject that gift It's like the greatest good. And so I say that with at least one caveat. It has to be a world in which universalism is true. So that's a term I'm taking from theological discourse, where in there it means specifically everyone ultimately achieves salvation or eternal life, like the good life of eternal bliss with God. So long as universalism is true, so that everyone is given immortal existence, I think I can't see any reason short of just superficial reflections that don't stand up to scrutiny to reject that offer. Now, there are some interesting arguments debated about the plausibility of like heaven as an eternal state. Maybe there's something intrinsically incoherent about the idea that like genuine happiness could endure infinitely. But I think those are implausible. And again, I mean, I think while in the abstract you could say that, it's like if you were standing before Zeus and he's like, here's, do you want eternal life? Like I would take it. Now at the same time, we have to fetter out some exceptional cases where it's like, you don't want to be like vampires out of Twilight, where it seems pretty horrific to be like immortal in that context, where they have to like eat people or like fight against their urges to eat people. And like everyone they love ultimately dies except for the 5 of them. I don't think that's what we want. That's like, so that's the thing. Okay, we're coming to a more refined answer here, Sam. Obviously, like eternal existence in hell would not be advisable. I would choose annihilation over that. So there are certain other conditions that have to obtain for me to take immortality. But if you were just like, here's immortality, we can't guarantee like eternal bliss, but it'll be on you to figure it out, I would take that. I would take those odds that I'd be able to figure out over infinite time how to eventually get to a state of like pretty solid, great vibes. What do you think, Sam?
It's interesting because my immediate answer or my immediate instinct is yes. But as you were talking, I was kind of reflecting on, it's interesting that we had immediate, or both of us, I think, had immediate kind of like visceral answers to the experience machine of no, because it devalues other experiences that we might have. And I kind of think the same thing applies to the immortality stuff, in that any individual experience I have as an immortal, and I guess, I don't know, it was interesting because you were kind of taking a perhaps more, I don't know, like theological approach to it. I'm just sort of thinking like, if I have immortality, like from now, as I'm living on in on earth without any kind of better potential prospect of kind of like a heaven or a hell or anything like that, it seems like it might devalue any individual experience I could have for the rest of my life, my infinite life. And so I don't know, my immediate thought of yes, I would love to be immortal. I've sort of kind of come around to the slight little reservation that perhaps the reason why I'm opposed to something like the experience machine should also be a reason why I should be opposed to being immortal, because it devalues any individual experience that I might have forever.
So in what sense does it do that? Like, what do you mean?
I guess because if I am immortal, and presumably, I don't know, is anybody else around me? Let's say no. Let's say nobody else is immortal. I will just go on living forever. I become like so separate to everything else that's happening. Any sort of meaningful relationship I form will eventually just will die off, because that other person is. I cannot ever maintain, sort of like, I guess any kind of like real love, where we think of love as something that kind of you go throughout your entire life, let's say, and hopefully you and your sort of partner die of old age or together, in close proximity or whatever. That just can't happen anymore. Real friendships in the same way feel sort of unequal now, so therefore feel kind of quite difficult. And I guess you'd gain this sort of weird perspective on things where no individual moment would probably matter, because you could just have that again at some point. You are like the living instance of monkeys typewriting Shakespeare, where it will happen. Everything will happen to you, and therefore any individual, and probably multiple times, any individual instance of anything doesn't really matter. There's nothing that I could do that will sort of like eventually nothing I could do that will wow me in any way.
I think that So the first point is that I agree with you. That's kind of what I meant by if universalism needs to be true. So my response is contingent on everyone else getting immortality, because I agree the most
Okay,
important
yeah.
things are genuine love and relationships. And yeah, if everyone around you dies, you also become. It's not just that you'll have to say goodbye to people, because that happens in the real world too. It's that you would eventually become someone incapable of relating to those around you. Like if you've lived 1 billion years and you're able in this situation to retain like your cultivated experience and knowledge, you aren't going to care, I think, at all in the same way about the people around you, because you just can't relate to them. You can't connect with them at all in the same way. So that was what I meant. Is like everyone around you needs to be immortal. Okay, well then there's a question of what's the value of any individual good if you can just do it again? And I don't know, because I'd asked my friend Matthew Adelstein this question of, if you have infinite time, like what motivates you to get out of bed, so to speak? Because anything you might want to do, you will always have time to do. But what he said was that it doesn't follow that therefore being in bed is better than anything else. The good ends are things that you might want to do. The amazing experiences and possibilities are still going to have their draw. They're still going to be better than sitting in bed. So you still have the same motivation to go pursue these good things because they feel better than staying in bed. And so there still will be room for a rational motivation to do things, but that still leaves unaddressed this question of whether you've devalued certain things. Like I get the idea that if something only exists for a moment, it's more valuable in a way than if it existed forever, because then it's kind of trivial. But I don't know. That's genuinely what I got for you.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's an interesting one because I think that obviously this isn't part of there's no stipulation in the answer because it just says sort of immortality, would you choose it? So I guess I've taken that to mean that would I as an individual choose it for myself as opposed to would I choose it for everyone? Um, and it's interesting because it also isn't. It's a fairly even divide
Yes.
in the answers. There's a slight advantage to yes, 44.92% accept or lean towards yes, and then 41.33% accept or lean towards no. And I think it is interesting actually that this is one of those things where I guess it is a sort of a more like a personal question when it comes in the same way that like asking people if they're atheists or theists is. And I guess that it also doesn't surprise me actually that you get a lot of philosophers are leaning towards yes, because I think that we all sort of think, God, I wish I had more time to read or more time to write or something like that, and that immortality obviously offers that as a solution. And you think that if you can never complete philosophy, you can never
Yes.
learn all there is to learn about it. You can obviously barely scratch the surface. Even thousands of years ago, they were never managing to do more than sort of like scratching the surface. So I think that I guess it is quite an appealing prospect, but I don't know. I guess that the more I thought about it, if I'm choosing it just for myself, then I think I would probably lean no, even though my initial instinct was yes.
Yeah. But what if everyone gets it? You got to press a button.
If everyone gets it, I think I am now leaning more towards yes. Um, because I think, I don't know, I just feel like that would be, I guess you do have the kind of potential worry about devaluing individual experiences. But then again, I guess if I was a theist, I would probably want to go to heaven, and therefore I suppose heaven, as in if I was a Christian, I would want to go to heaven, and therefore I think that heaven would look something like that. Heaven is described as eternity, and therefore I guess I want to that is the immortality right
Yeah.
there. So yeah, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I had the opposite reaction seeing 42% say no, and I was like, oh, you liars. There is no way that if you were offered immortality of a sufficiently specified kind, that you'd be like, no, on principle, I've thought about that, I'm not taking it. Because
Yeah.
to me, like, probably the number one motivational factor underlying human behavior from our evolutionary past to now, if at only a subconscious or unconscious level, is fear of death. And that's because we don't want to die. It's not just because we don't want to experience pain in death, but we do not want to die, Epicurus notwithstanding.
Mm.
And so, or whether or not, once we distinguish between what we do think and what we ought to think, it's the case descriptively that we do have this fear. And I mean, philosophers are people too. And so I just think, push comes to shove, I think the vast majority of people would accept the gift versus not. And that includes philosophers. And so maybe what they're saying is, no, I'm answering the should question. What should I do versus what would I do? But yeah, I looked at that and was rather cynically like, oh, really? Really?
Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, you philosopher king doing what like the better option, even though, yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so that gives us immortality. Final point. Philosophical progress. Does philosophy make progress? The apt comparison here would be to science. Science, over the last 400 years anyway, has made astounding progress, both advancing our knowledge for its own sake and technological progress. Does philosophy make progress? And if so, what kind? The answers that you could give were like, no, a little, and a lot. So yeah, Sam, does philosophy make progress?
This is such an interesting one because I feel like I do like to hang out on that. I like to read the sort of the r/ask philosophy Reddit, which is actually pretty good. You know, there's plenty of probably poor philosophy Reddit threads, but that one is good. And I think there's an interesting. I feel like I've seen that question come up about like, do we have solved topics in philosophy, or even ones, where you kind of think like, have previous positions been proven obsolete, or have we kind of narrowed down perhaps how we might think of a topic? And it's interesting because I think that in a lot of cases you could say, yes, we have made quite substantial progress with a lot of things that were considered philosophy, in that Aristotle has been proven wrong about how the universe works, or Aristotle's physics has been kind of heavily brought into question because obviously he was working with kind of very subpar science at the time, like compared to what we have now, or the measuring influence we have now and everything. He would know immediately that the Earth is not the center of the universe or something like that. So I don't know. I guess I wouldn't say no, and I think that the progress doesn't have to mean, this is actually the follow-up point I should be making, is that progress doesn't have to mean that we have solved topics. It just simply means that we have reached greater clarity on positions within topics, and I think that is a resounding yes. Whether that constitutes like a little or a lot, or whether we mean that, I guess what I would say is that we have progressed a little in a lot of areas, perhaps, is the best way of summarizing it. And we have added new areas. So I guess philosophy has progressed quite substantially in that we now have tons more subdisciplines than we did thousands of years ago, where philosophy, you get like, this is one of the, it's easy to criticize Plato for many, many things, but he was working with far less than we had now, and he was inventing so much. And you've got to think like the scope of philosophy is conical. It just keeps expanding and expanding and expanding. And I think that that just, you can tell that change from just Plato to Aristotle. And now obviously you have people specialize, as we've commented on, in these tiny little subdisciplines. So I think that, I guess I don't really, obviously they've probably deliberately left this broad because how do you define a lot of progress? But I'm leaning between the two, little and a lot, and I guess it would depend how you would ask me to define those.
I agree with everything you've said, and it comes down to progress with respect to what. And so I would say that with respect to truth, to learning the true positions within the relevant subdisciplines, we've made a little progress. But with respect to understanding, we've made a lot of progress. And so that goes back to my overarching views about the aims of philosophy. Like I think compared to 1,000 years ago to now, the lay of the philosophical landscape, of the conceptual landscape, has been remarkably advanced. I mean, almost incomprehensibly so. And one aspect of that is the fact that you just have so many more people concentrating on narrower and narrower topics. You're going to get a more clear understanding of like, what are the options here? What do they really assert? The other aspect to it, of that same like mapping of the terrain, that I think it was Alex Malpass who I was speaking with said to me that philosophy is really good for ruling out positions, but it's not nearly as good for establishing positions. I think that's probably right. Like it's much easier to point out a flaw in an argument than to successfully show that your argument succeeds. And I think that underlies the fact that if you want to make that jump to this philosophical position is true, it's going to involve an irreducible element of like speculation. Because so much of what philosophers do is we're just sitting, we're reading, and we're thinking really, really hard. There's no experiments you carry out largely. You're just trying to think about these things, and you have to keep in your mind so many different moving parts at once that it's just very, very difficult to carry out. And if you make any progress at all to establishing certain things, it's just a little, and it's subtle. It's much more subtle than I've proved God or I've proved free will. Far more often you can rule out positions. So for example, in the early 20th century, within the school of logical positivism, you had the verificationist theory of meaning, which stated that roughly a statement is meaningful only insofar as that statement is empirically verifiable. That's what meaning in a claim or sentence meant. The problem, as philosophers came to realize, is that the very statement of verificationism is not itself empirically verifiable and would therefore be meaningless. And so the position was just self-refuting and has been largely abandoned. So that's an example of philosophy winnowing down the scope of live options and therefore making genuine progress. But undeniably, I think it would be disingenuous to say that philosophy makes progress akin to science. I think it doesn't. It doesn't. We have not approached a place where we have a large scale philosophical worldview that addresses all these issues, where there's broadly consensus opinion. And now the question just is, okay, it's approximately correct, but how do we fit all the pieces together? What's the final theory of philosophy going to ultimately look like? This is 90% correct, but what are the details? That's not the case. That's not the case. There's substantial disagreement about perennial questions of philosophy today, just as there was then. So to me, I think that makes it pretty clear that as far as truth is concerned, it's just a little. But the progress in understanding the positions and viewpoints and the arguments and seeing clearly flawed arguments, okay, making better ones, that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah. And it's interesting you brought up the ruling out thing, because I think that's most apparent probably in, I would say, political philosophy, because you can kind of think back through hundreds of years of political philosophy, and we really have kind of come to more or less agreement, I suppose, on what are the wrong kinds of political systems or whatever. And, like Aristotle and Plato famously sort of defended slavery, and, we now know that is sort of we see it as an indefensible position, things like that. So there are kind of, we have made progress in sort of hemming things out. Often, I suppose, they are quite small things, I think, to be able to completely get rid of them. But yeah, I think you're right that's what the progress does look like. Is it's getting rid of, or at least casting into doubt, bad arguments, or even like what might have been good arguments at the time, but we now have managed to work out why they are now bad arguments. Let's say, or subpar arguments.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. This case of ethical reflection clearly has progressed. And insofar as we can encompass that within philosophy, that points to a really great example of, ostensibly, we didn't talk about moral realism, but if you're a moral realist, you think that we've gotten better and better ethical theories and have gotten closer and closer to the true ethical facts of the matter. So that's philosophy, and therefore philosophy has at least made progress there. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Well, Sam, this has been a pleasure. I mean this. I'm not just saying it because you're right there, so to speak, virtually. But this has been one of my favorite podcast episodes and conversations. This was fun. So thank you. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.